James and Carol Duffy decide they want to go camping. So they have this big RV camper and they load up their 2 kids, Jimmy, who was 2, and Natalie, who was a little over 1 year old, along with their 2 cats, and they take off for Lake Wenatchee. They park their RV, they all get out, they're going on a little walk, but the kids seem fussy, and so Carol and James decide to put them down for a nap. Carol takes the kids inside the RV. They're in there with the 2 cats. She shuts and locks the RV and goes outside. Carol decides she's going to walk a little ways around the lake, but keeping an eye on the RV the whole time. James was within eyesight of the camper as well. And after about 15 minutes, James goes back to the camper and checks on the kids. James goes in, the kids are sleeping, the cats are sleeping. He turns and he sees Carol. He gives her a thumbs up and then actually walks over to her. And they're walking a little bit farther away, so they're still only about 150 meters away when they hear a scream coming from their camper. They kind of ran back on the path to get a better look, and all they can see is the door to the camper is now open. James gets there first, he goes inside, and his son, Jimmy, is gone. Their youngest child and their 2 cats were still sleeping. Carol and James were on the other side of this lake when they heard this screech coming from the RV. It seems odd that the cats and Natalie wouldn't wake up to that, but they didn't. After an initial frantic search of the area where they can't find Jimmy, they call the police, they show up, and they begin doing a search themselves. And after 2 hours of aggressively combing this whole campsite, there wasn't that many people there, so they were able to interview everyone, and everyone had an alibi. No one was near their camper. The police start to feel really suspicious about Carol and James. And in fact, they straight up accuse James of hurting his child and trying to cover it up. But James and Carol swear they were on the other side of the lake, and so for 4 days there's this massive search with canines, helicopters, you name it. There is nothing, no sign of this child. And so the suspicion that Carol or James had something to do with the disappearance of this child only grew. And so eventually both parents were subjected to a polygraph test, and both stuck to their story, and both passed. They had nothing to do with the disappearance of their child. They were telling the truth. The police still felt like there's something off here. So they really dug into the family backgrounds, and every single person in this family's circle and even outer circle said, no, they care about their kids. They would never harm Jimmy. But through their digging, one thing that did come up is that Jimmy was actually considered a very frail child that basically couldn't do anything without assistance. He didn't get up, open the camper, escape, and then evade this massive search effort. So all you're left with is abduction. But the police, they basically cordoned off this whole site and were able to account for every single person that was in the park at any time while the Duffys were there. And every single person had an alibi and completely checked out. Eventually, the search for Jimmy was terminated, and to this day, almost 50 years later, we still have no idea what happened to Jimmy, where he went, and how he got there. John Sullivan, who was with his nephew, Lawrence Sullivan, who was only 3 years old, they were driving together in the middle of the Nevada desert. In this very remote area, John was a gold prospector, and he was heading to an area that he wanted to scout out. So he drives down the road, he parks the car, and he turns to Lawrence, and he says, hey, I'm gonna go over this hill for a minute and check the area out. Stay in here, don't leave the car, I'll be right back. John gets out, he locks the car, he walks up to the top of the hill, and he turns around, looks at Lawrence, and waves at him. Lawrence looks up at his uncle and he waves back, and he's smiling. So clear interaction. So John turns his back on Lawrence. He goes over the hill. He's now out of sight of the vehicle, and he does a short inspection of this area that he wanted to prospect. He goes back up over the hill, and he sees immediately that the door is now open and Lawrence is not in the vehicle anymore. John is not immediately concerned. He can't have gone very far, and there's nowhere to even go. So he goes down, he looks in the car, he looks under the car, he's yelling for Lawrence, no response. After a little while, and he can't hear anything, he hasn't seen Lawrence, he's starting to get very desperate because they are in the middle of nowhere. So John has to make this totally painful decision to get in his car and drive and get help. And so he leaves Lawrence, the sheriff comes out there, and they start this massive search for this child. This whole time, John is convinced someone had to abduct him because Lawrence knew where John was. If he was to get out of the vehicle, he would have walked over the hill to where John was. In the first few days of the search, they can't find any tracks of the child or another person that could have potentially abducted him, or even tracks of an animal that could have potentially taken Lawrence away. There's just nothing. They did find his hat, But that was it. There's no other evidence to go off of. And so after 4 days of searching, the newspapers began running headlines about potentially an eagle swooping down and taking Lawrence away. At this point, the police feel totally helpless. They don't understand how this child has managed to evade capture. They're not ready to accept that an eagle has taken him away. And so the police bring in a Native American tracker who was known in the area as an exceptional tracker. So this tracker comes in and manages to pick up a partial trail of this child, and they get 7 miles away from where this boy went missing. And the tracker begins going up the side of this cliff. They have to actually bring in climbing equipment. They go 1,400 feet up this cliff, and they get all the way up there, and there's this one little rocky shelf that this tracker has brought them to. And sure enough, on this shelf is Lawrence, and he's more or less unharmed. He's sleeping, he's tucked up against this tree. But interestingly, the tree had this bough that was fairly elastic, and it had clearly been placed over his neck, basically trapping him tight up against the mountain. It was like he had fallen into a trap. Had he moved suddenly, he would have broken his neck the way he was positioned. So the police carefully undo the branch, and they bring the boy down. He's unharmed. He's a couple scratches on his face, but that's about it. They have no idea how he, one, got 7 miles away and then over 400 meters up a sheer cliff that adults needed climbing equipment to get to. And then how did you survive the below freezing temperatures? You were out here for nearly a week. Nobody knows. I'm just incredibly thankful for your support. And until next time, guys, that's going to do it. See ya.